È un grande onore essere stato invitato a questa conferenza in Vaticano per parlare in compagnia di un così illustre e interessante gruppo di relatori sul messaggio della montagna. Perdonate il mio tentativo maldestro di parlare italiano, la più melodiosa delle lingue. Now I will switch to English. I would like to thank the Holy See, in particular the Dicastery of Culture and Education and the Mountain Partnership of the United Nations for organizing the conference and for inviting me to participate. My thanks in particular to Monsignor Melchor Sanchez de Toca, Rosa Laura Romeo, Sara Manueli, and Samantha Abear. I'd like to open with the first two sentences of my book, Sacred Mountains of the World, to set the tone of the presentation and hopefully the conference. As the highest and most dramatic features of the natural landscape, mountains have an extraordinary power to evoke the sacred. The ethereal rise of a ridge in mist, the glint of moonlight on an icy face, a flare of gold on a distant peak. Such glimpses of transcendent beauty can reveal our world as a place of unimaginable mystery and splendor, a world, I might add, that we desperately need to protect and preserve. This presentation will be in the spirit of Laudato Si and its message, Pope Francis' message on preserving the environment as the gift of God. So I'd like to just, how do I get into this? When I was 2 years old, my father was a diplomat, and we moved to Quito, Ecuador. And my earliest memories are of snow-capped peaks on the equator, like Cotopaxi, which you see here, thought for many years to be the highest active volcano in the world. When I returned as a teenager, I was put in touch with an Ecuadorian mountaineering club called Nuevos Horizontes, New Horizons. And I went up, I was drawn to snow. There was something magical and pure when snow falls, it transforms the world, it becomes very white, pure, and mysterious. Evokes the sacred, although I wouldn't have said so in so many words when I was young. And I went up into the mountains, climbed, and this is an Ecuadorian companion of mine, Romulo Pasmino, climbing a Serac ice tower on the way to climbing a peak, an unclimbed peak in the Andes. When I graduated from college, I went with the Peace Corps to Nepal, the highest mountains in the world. And there I went on an expedition to Annapurna South, which is 7,200 meters high. And rather than reach the summit, we were climbing up and a hanging glacier broke off above us. And I was caught in the avalanche and swept maybe 1,000 feet down. It was ice. As far as I knew, you didn't survive an avalanche like that. And I was completely convinced I was going to die. Now you might ask, how did I survive? Well, I survived by giving up. I thought it was entirely hopeless. And at that point, something deep within rose up and took over and did everything very smoothly, precisely, as though I knew exactly what I was doing, but I didn't know it all. And that's how I got out of the avalanche, basically sort of suddenly popped out without any conscious direction on my part. And in this experience, which I won't go into detail, I learned something of the power and mystery of mountains and the power and mystery of what they can awaken within each one of us. So following this, I went out on a kind of pilgrimage to see Mount Everest, the highest mountain in the world. And while I was doing that, I managed to trek back to Kathmandu with a group of Tibetans and Sherpas and the abbot of Tengboche Monastery, which you see here on the south side of Everest. But I should add, before I did that, we climbed this peak here, which is about 6,000 meters high. We thought we'd made the first descent of an unclimbed peak. And for 11 years, I had the pleasure of thinking that until I ran into somebody who climbed it before us. But 11 years was a good run, and I was quite happy with that. So I trekked back to Kathmandu, and out of this came a project to list and microfilm Tibetan texts at this monastery. So I returned, and this is me in a younger incarnation with the abbot of the monastery on the left. The monastery is Tengboche, and he had given me this Tibetan nobleman's robe, which you see on the right. Now, in the course of doing this research, I became interested in what mountains mean not only to Tibetans and Sherpas, but to people around the world. And that eventually led to my writing a book on sacred mountains of the world and going in projects that came out of that. So let's begin. If we look at what makes mountains sacred or inspirational, there are many ways, but I think at a very deep level, one can say that mountains have the power to evoke an experience of something of deeper significance or reality that gives meaning and vitality to people's lives. However one may conceive of that significance or reality, it may be God, nature, emptiness, or just being in touch with something mystery within oneself. And this translates across many different cultures. Now, generally, people experience that something of deeper significance or reality through the views they have of mountains. And I've identified 10 views or themes that are particularly widespread around the world. And we'll explore a few of them because we don't have much time in this talk. And the first one that normally people think of is the mountain as a high place because it's high, close to heaven, close to what's divine. And the mountain that represents that, of course, is Mount Everest, the highest mountain in the world. Now, if you look at this picture, which I took from Tibet of the Everest, you'll see right next to the summit is a little white dot. That's the planet Jupiter next to the summit. Since Jupiter in Greek mythology, Jupiter is Latin, Jupiter is Zeus in Greek mythology. So this would make Mount Olympus the true Mount Everest, the true Mount Olympus, the abode of Zeus, which you see here. Now, the most famous reason, at least in the English world, given for climbing mountains is because it's there. This was an answer that was given by George Mallory in the 1920s, a British climber, when he was asked why he wanted to climb Everest. And he said, because it's there. Now, he disappeared in Everest and his body was found a few years ago. But you have to ask a second question. There's more to it than just because it's there. You have to ask, what is the it that's there? And I would maintain that for many climbers, whether they realize it or not, the it that's there is that something of deeper significance or reality that gives meaning and vitality to people's lives. Now, I wouldn't say that every climber does this. There are many, many different reasons why people climb, more reasons than there are climbers themselves, but this is one of an important reason. Now, because of this, Everest is the highest mountain in the world, has assumed a semi-sacred status in the modern world because the modern world tends to put an ultimate value or concern on whatever is number one, highest, and Everest is the highest mountain in the world. And it's come to symbolize for many people the highest goal you can strive to attain, whether your pursuit be material or spiritual. And of course, there are problems that come out of that. Now, because of that, the Tibetan name of Mount Everest is Chomolungma or Jomolangma, and that until recently has almost always been mistranslated in Western and outside literature as Goddess Mother of the World, because foreigners assume that for Tibetans and Sherpas, the highest mountain in the world must be the abode of a supremely important deity. Turns out that's not the case. Jomolangma in Tibetan is short for Jomo Myolang Sangma, which is the name of the goddess of the mountain. The Tibetan language is monosyllabic like Chinese, so each syllable has a meaning. And rather than making acronyms, the Tibetans and Sherpas will contract a long string of syllables. So Jomo Myolang Sangma contracts down to Jomolangma, and she's a relatively minor goddess. First of all, in Tibetan Buddhism, there is no goddess mother of the world, so it doesn't really fit the religion. And she's considered, she gives worldly benefits like long life and wealth and so on. Now, for the higher attainments, the transcendent attainments of spiritual liberation and enlightenment that stand at the heart of many Asian religions, there's a mountain which is much more important, considerably lower than Mount Everest, called Mount Kailas in Western Tibet. And you see it here. Kailas is about 7,000 some meters high, actually a bit less, it's 6,700 meters, but it stands by itself, as you can see, and it has the shape of a Buddhist monument called a stupa or a Hindu temple, stands out. And it's the most sacred mountain in the world for about 1 billion people, not 1 million, but 1 billion, and followers of at least 4 religions, including Hinduism and Buddhism. For Hindus, it's the abode of Lord Shiva, who's one of the 3 forms of the supreme deity, who is said to abode on the summit. And here you see a Hindu pilgrim bathing in the sacred lake Manasaravad and offering water to the mountain. Kailas is the end of one of the longest and most arduous, at least in the past, pilgrimages in the world. Hindus will come up from India 3 weeks over very high passes over the Himalayas. In the past, Tibetans would ride on horseback for months across the plateau to get to this mountain. Here you see a Tibetan woman who has come on pilgrimage, and she's come for the spiritual experience of a lifetime, and you can see that showing in her face. Now, when you come to this mountain, you don't climb it, you walk around it, you treat it as a religious monument. And the circumambulation is about 50 kilometers. It took us about 2.5 days. Tibetans who are in very good shape, grandchildren and grandmothers will do it in one long day. Now, for both Hindus and Buddhists and other religions, the mountain is sacred in many ways, but one way is it's a center. So this is another theme, the mountain as a sacred center. It's supposed to be the physical manifestation of an axis mundi, a cosmic axis that links all realms of existence from the depths of hell through our world to the heights of heaven. And it dwarfs Mount Everest. The mountain is 80,000 yojanas high. A yojana is more than a kilometer, so Everest dwindles to nothing in comparison. And here you see a representation of the mountain at a Buddhist monastery in Bhutan. Tibet's most famous yogi, Milarepa, who lived in the 11th century, had this to say of Mount Kailas. The prophecy of Buddha says most truly that this snow mountain is the navel of the world. This is the great place of accomplished yogis. Here one attains transcendent accomplishments. There is no place more wonderful than this. There is no place more marvelous than here. The height of the circumambulation is the Pass of the Saviors, which you see here at a rather high altitude at over 5,600 meters. And the Tibetan woman in the foreground is giving away a piece of herself, an old tooth, a lock of hair, symbolizing that she's relinquishing attachment to the isolated ego in order to attain enlightenment or liberation for the sake of all beings. And one of the ways in which Kailas functions very importantly is that it symbolizes the way in which within each person in their center, they can awaken the spiritual forces of wisdom and compassion, which are both necessary to attain liberation in the Buddhist tradition or moksha, release in the Hindu. Now, jumping across the world to my country, and as appropriately, of course, these are the San Francisco peaks in Arizona. I live near San Francisco in California, but these peaks were named San Francisco many years before San Francisco even became a town by the Spanish who came up here. These are the highest peaks in Arizona, and they're sacred to 16 different tribes, American Indian tribes, in particular the Hopi and the Navajo, and you can see the Hopi and Navajo names below there. Now, here the mountain represents the theme of the source of blessing, and blessings of various kinds. In particular here, there's the blessing of water, and water is life. So for the Hopi who live on the Colorado Plateau and are agriculturalists, they invoke the ancestral rain spirits that are supposed to dwell on the San Francisco peaks called the Kachinas. They invoke them in the famous Kachina dances. This is a Kachina doll in order to bring rain clouds so that they can grow corn and survive. So water is life, and water comes from the mountains. Now, for the Hopi, or the Navajo, on the other hand, who live in the same area, who would live a different kind of life, a pastoral life, the mountains are involved. First of all, San Francisco peaks are one of 4 mountains in the 4 directions that surround their sacred land called Dinata, and they're invoked in healing ceremonies. So the blessing here is healing and health. And here you see a traditional Navajo singer or healer who's drawing with sand the Holy Spirit of one of these mountains. And the idea is that when somebody is sick, they're sick because they've fallen out of harmony with themselves, with others, and with the environment. And so the healing ceremony is to restore them to this original state of harmony. And they do it by chanting what are called chantways, the most important of which is Blessing Way. And here is a line from it. Now I am long life, now happiness, as I have ascended. Before me it is blessed as I have ascended. Behind me it is blessed as I have ascended. Ascended, I have ascended. Oh yeah. Now, if we shift over to Africa, Mount Kenya, which you see here, is a major sacred mountain. And Kenya is the mispronunciation of the Kikuyu name Kirinyaga, which means the mountain of brightness, which you can see reflected in this photograph. Mount Kenya is one of the only mountains in the world to have a country named after it, which is the modern country of Kenya. And I leave it to you as to what other country there is. Maybe that'd be a question and answers. Now, according to the Kikuyu, are the largest ethnic group in Kenya. And according to their origin story, first of all, the summit of Mount Kenya is the resting place of Ngai, or God. And the story is that Ngai brought up the first Kikuyu man to the summit of Kirinyaga, and he pointed out the land that he would give him and his people. And then he said, whenever you need me, invoke me, face the mountain. This became the central religion of all Kikuyu culture, the central ceremony. So if there's a marriage ceremony, a circumcision ceremony, a village gathering, they first face the mountain. It was so important that the founder of the modern state of, let's see, get this, yes, of Kenya, Jomo Kenyatta, whom you see here, was originally studied anthropology with Malinowski in London, and he wrote a book about his people called Facing Mount Kenya for this very reason. Now, Mount Kenya is the scene of one of the most incredible ascents, or a series of ascents, I think, in mountaineering history. What happened is in the background, you can see Nelian and Batian, the two highest peaks, and there's a very difficult, technically very demanding route over the head of this ranger whom I met. And a couple of British climbers climbed this very demanding route, and they got to the summit. Who should they find on the summit but an old African in plastic sandals and a blanket wrapped around his shoulder? And they said, well, you know, let us help you get down. And he said, no, I've come up here to pray for the welfare of humanity for 3 days and 3 nights. So the Brits went back down, and they went to the park ranger, including this person here. And they said, you've got to rescue this poor fellow, he's stranded on the summit. So they came out with their climbing gear, and they were having trouble getting started in the first cliff, clanking around with their crampons and their carabiners and their pitons, when who should come nimbly scrambling down from the mist, but the Africans say, don't bother me, I do this once a year, and disappeared in the mist. And here you can see a closer view of what he had climbed. Quite remarkable. I had wanted to interview him when I went there, but by then he was too old and senile to actually talk to, so I talked to the rangers instead. Now, mountains, as have been indicated already in the talks here, are very important, of course, in Western tradition, in Judaism, Christianity, and also in Islam. And this is the mountain that's usually identified, especially in Christian tradition, with Mount Sinai in the Bible, Jebel Musa, the mountain of Moses. And I'm assuming you're all familiar, of course, with Moses going up on the mountain. And the summit of the mountain is the meeting place of man and God, where Moses is given the tablets of the law and the first 5 books of the Bible, the Torah, and Jewish tradition brings it back down. Now, the revelation and covenant made at Mount Sinai is considered the single most important event in traditional Jewish history. And it's also important to note that the 3 most important events in the Old Testament, especially the first 5 books of Moses, are the 3 covenants made, Mount Ararat, Mount Moriah for the Akedah, the binding of Isaac, and finally this, which is the most important, which is Mount Sinai. At the foot of Jebel Musa is the monastery of St. Catherine, one of the oldest Christian monasteries in the world. Desert Fathers came here around the 2nd century, started to meditate because they wanted to be in a place where Moses came face to face with God. And in the 6th century, an emperor of Byzantium built this fortified monastery for them on the traditional site of the burning bush. When I came there with my family, this is in the Sinai Peninsula, we interviewed the abbot, Archbishop Damiamos, who's Greek Orthodox, about it. And in 1988 or so, the Egyptian government, which had taken over the Sinai from Israel, announced plans to build a cable car up to the top of Mount Sinai and to put a casino restaurant on the top. This aroused consternation throughout the world, and Time magazine published an essay titled Trashing Mount Sinai that decried the development and ended with this comment: perhaps they will make the cable cars in the shape of calves and gild them. The golden calves can slide up and down Mount Sinai and show God who won. Basically, they shamed the government out of abandoning that, and it didn't happen, fortunately. So here you see a psalter from the 12th century from Denmark, showing Moses receiving the original call at the burning bush, which is at the foot of Mount Sinai. And then in the lower frame, he's receiving the tablets of the law on Mount Sinai. And you can see in this epoch back in the Middle Ages, mountains were sort of not very emphasized. It looks like it's been squeezed out of a toothpaste tube, the mountain on the right. Now you'll notice that Moses has a halo around his head, because in the Bible it says he comes down with his face shining with light. He's transfigured. And of course, the word that for light was mistranslated, and that's why the famous statue of by Michelangelo of Moses here in Rome has horns on his head, which is erroneous. In any case, the transfiguration of Moses on Mount Sinai prefigured the transfiguration of Jesus on Mount Tabor. And of course, this is the famous transfiguration painting by Raphael, which hangs here in the Vatican. And significantly in the gospel, and of course in this painting, he's transfigured with light, accompanied by Elijah and Moses on either side, the two Old Testament prophets who had experiences on Mount Sinai. Now, Pope Francis, a few years ago, gave a talk based on the story of the Transfiguration, and this is what he wrote. The mountain is the site of the encounter, intimate closeness with God, the place of prayer in which to stand in the presence of the Lord. We need to go to a place of retreat, climb the mountain, and go to a place of silence, to find ourselves and better perceive the voice of the Lord. The encounter with God in prayer again pushes us to come down from the mountain and back down into the plain, where we meet many brothers and sisters weighed down by fatigue, injustice, and both material and spiritual poverty. So it's not enough just to climb and have the experience of communion with God. One needs to bring something back down for the welfare of others and for the preservation of the environment itself. Now, I just mentioned this very briefly since we don't have a lot of time, but Jerusalem itself, the two most common ways in which it's referred to in the Tanakh, the later books of the Old Testament after the 5 books of Moses, is either as the mountain of the Lord or Mount Zion. And in fact, Jerusalem is a conflation of 2 sacred mountains, Mount Zion, which was the fortified sacred mountain hillside of the Jebusite city that David converted into Jerusalem, the capital of Israel, and Mount Moriah, which is the site where Abraham took up Isaac to offer him in sacrifice. And you can see the 3 religions here, for which Jerusalem, of course, is sacred. The Al-Aqsa Mosque in the foreground, which is the 3rd most sacred site in the Muslim world, and the place where Muhammad on his celebrated night journey was supposed to have come from Mecca on his horse, and then gone up to the 7th heaven and received the highest revelations from this place. In the background is a Jewish cemetery, and of course the Mount of Olives, where Jesus ascended at the end of his life. Now, mountains are also extremely important as another theme. We've seen the theme of mountain as a place of revelation now. They're also places of transformation and inspiration. And this is one of the 5 most important sacred mountains in China. This is Hua Shan, the most spectacular of the 5. China probably has the longest record of ascents of mountains of any culture in history. According to the Chinese annals, in the 3rd millennium before the Common Era, the legendary first emperors of China were supposed to have gone ritual tours of every 4 or 5 years, ritual tours of the empire. And in each quarter of the empire, they would climb a mountain to establish sovereignty over the princes of the realm. And in fact, the most important official in the court of the emperor had the title the 4 mountains. So you can see the importance of mountains. This is the Western mountain, very, very important. And let me just read, since we're talking about women moving mountains. This is by Tao Yuan, who is the wife of a Chinese general in 400. And this is what she wrote about the Eastern mountain, which is a different one. High rises the eastern peak, soaring up the blue sky. Among the rocks, an empty hollow, secret, still, mysterious. I will lodge forever in this hollow, where springs and autumns unheeded path. Beautiful line. So, mountains, in particular in China, are extremely important. Chinese landscapes are perhaps the most sophisticated genre of landscape painting in the world. And the term for landscape in Chinese, shan shui, and landscape painting means literally mountains and water or mountains and rivers. Those are the 2 basic components. Now, in the Taoist religion of China, the mountains reveal the presence of the Tao, which is a spiritual essence of reality, which appears now and then flowing through nature like a mountain emerging and disappearing into the mist. This is one of the great classics of Chinese landscape painting called Early Spring. It was painted in 1072 by Guoxi, who also wrote a primer about landscape painting. And this is what he had to say about the value of landscapes and landscape paintings and mountains. The din of the dusty world and the confines of human habitations are what human nature habitually abhors, while on the contrary, haze, mist, and the haunting spirits of the mountains are what human nature seeks and yet can rarely find, something I think we can all relate to. Now, when we climbed Hua Shan, it has thousands of meters of sheer granite walls, and they've cut steps up there. And this boy was climbing quite easily in a basket on his father's back with a drop of maybe 1,000 meters below him, but quite nonchalant about it. I should point out that Chinese began climbing mountains for recreation well over 1,000 years before alpinism was born here in Europe. And one of the reasons was there were literati in the court of the emperor, and they were so confined by the strictures of the bureaucracy that they fled to the mountains for rest and recreation. So here is a poem from the 5th century that indicates what mountain climbing meant to Chinese. In the mountains, all is pure, all is calm, all complication is cut off. One pauses on ledges, one climbs to the foot of high clouds. Here is the realm of harmony and joy, where the past and the present become eternal. And I wish all of us could experience this as we climb mountains or contemplate. Now, speaking of mountaineering here in Europe, of course, the birth of alpinism is associated with the first ascent of Mont Blanc, or here in Italy, Monte Bianco. And what happened with the Alps in particular is, if you look at what Irish monks wrote about hills and sacred mountains in Ireland and in Wales, originally in the Celtic religion, mountains were sacred and divine places. They were hollow, and inside were Celtic deities. Then later on, during the Middle Ages in particular, mountains became sacred in a negative sense. They were demonic, and therefore there were dragons and witches and all sorts of unpleasant things connected with them. And then with the Enlightenment and the Romantic period, there was a shift in attitude back to the divine sense of mountains, to the idea of the sublime. And you can see this reflected in a letter that Goethe wrote about coming and seeing Mont Blanc at Chamonix during the night. And he speaks now of the mountain among the stars. Mount Mont Blanc, was clear without brilliance, like the Milky Way, but more dense, a bit like the Pleiades, only more extensive, shining among the stars that surrounded it, glittering not as brightly, but with a vaster, more coherent mass. The mountain appeared to belong to a higher sphere. So you can see here the transformation of the idea of the sublime. And it's no coincidence that only a few years later, with the birth of alpinism, that alpinism coincided with this idea of the mountains being a place of sublimity and spiritual inspiration. It's right there at the birth of mountaineering. And of course, this was helped a great deal by Jean-Jacques Rousseau and his writings, in particular La Nouvelle Héloïse, which inspired people to go to the Alps in great numbers in the 18th century. So here's a view of Mont Blanc, and Pope Pius XI, Pope Ratti, was a mountaineer and climber before he became Pope. He climbed Mont Blanc, Monte Bianco. He also put in a new route, I think, across Monte Rosa, quite accomplished. And in 1923, this is something that he wrote about the spiritual symbolism of mountain climbing. In the laborious efforts to gain the summits where the air is lighter and purer, the climber gains new strength of limb, while in the endeavor to overcome the countless obstacles of the way, the soul trains itself to conquer the difficulties of duty. And the superb spectacle of the vast horizons, which from the crest of the Alps offers themselves on all sides to our eyes, raises without effort our spirits to the divine author and sovereign of nature. Now, mountains have continued to inspire people well into the 20th century for this sort of reason. This is the highest mountain in New Zealand, Mount Aoraki, also known as Mount Cook. It's sacred to the Maori people. And for the Maori people, certain groups, each mountain is the frozen ancestor of their tribe and is the main symbol of who they are. Now, I won't go into the Maori culture here, but I'd like to point out this is something that Bredna Dufour, an Australian climber who was the first woman to climb Aoraki, which is a rather difficult climb. This is what she wrote about the mountains, these New Zealand Alps, and how they inspired her. From the moment that my eyes rested on the snow-clad Alps of New Zealand, I worshiped their beauty and was filled with a passionate yearning to touch these shining snows, to climb to their heights of silence and solitude, and feel myself one with the mighty forces around me. And you certainly see that sort of deeper sense of the sublime and the spiritual inspiration of mountains that they had for her and many other women. In more contemporary writing, you have the very well-known French mountaineer Catherine Destivelle, and this is what she wrote about her motivation to go climbing. For the little city dweller that I was, life in the mountains represented paradise, a life free from all constraints where only nature dictates its law. So here we see another theme connected with mountains of view. The mountains is an earthly paradise, reflecting a higher paradise, and also a place of freedom. Very, very important. In the United States, where I live, this is Yosemite Valley, Half Dome, and John Muir is one of the founders of the modern day environmental movement, at least in the United States. For him, Yosemite Valley was a temple far finer than any made by human hands. He wrote this way, and this is what he wrote about going up into the mountains. Climb the mountains and get their good tidings. Nature's peace will flow into you as sunshine flows into trees. The winds will blow their own freshness into you, and the storms their energy, while cares will drop off like autumn leaves. It's important to note that the birth of the environmental movement had a lot to do with protecting mountains in particular as places people could go to for spiritual renewal as well as physical renewal and health. Now, because of this, I started and directed a program with an organization called the Mountain Institute, in which we worked with U.S. national parks. We called it the Sacred Mountains program. And one of the parks we worked with was Mount Rainier National Park in the northwest part of the United States. Mount Rainier is an enormous volcano, and it's become an icon of the Pacific Northwest. People of cities like Seattle identify with it. It functions very much like Mount Fuji in Japan as a symbol of the Japanese people. And in fact, there's a sister mountain relationship between Mount Rainier and Mount Fuji. So we did a project in a number of parks, and I'm just going to give you a little indication of this particular project. This was a traveling exhibit called Mountain Views, and it had 3 panels. On the right was a panel about how people at the park were inspired by the mountain to work there, then well-known environmentalists, geologists, and so on. And then on the left, very interesting, first of all, when this was put out, it's what does the mountain mean to you was the important question, and they would put out a sheet of paper and people would write on it and take this back to the park. Now, on the left was Mountains of the World, and what we did was we looked at other mountains that were icons, like Mount Rainier. So Mount Fuji, Mount Kailas, which you've seen, Mount Kilimanjaro, and also you can see Martin Luther King Jr., famous civil rights leader, whose most famous speech, I Have a Dream, was all about freedom ringing from mountains all over the United States, which he named. Now, this is very, very important. In fact, right up at the top, you can't see it here, but it says, mountains awaken a sense of wonder and awe. Because of their inspirational qualities, mountains reflect the highest values of people and cultures around the world. And one reason we did this, and one reason the U.S. National Park Service was very interested in this, was we were reaching out to different ethnic groups, so-called minorities in the U.S. that haven't been going to parks, like African Americans, Hispanic people, and looking at their backgrounds and encouraging them to go, which is very important for the National Park Service. So, for example, with Mount Kilimanjaro, which we have here, which is an icon of Africa, this is something that Julius Nyerere wrote. He was the founder of the modern state of Tanganyika, which became Tanzania. And on the night of its liberation, A couple of Tanganyikan climbers went up to the summit of Kilimanjaro and shot fireworks. And then this was put in a plaque. So any of you who climbed Kilimanjaro will see this saying by Julius Nyerere. We will light a candle on top of Mount Kilimanjaro, which will shine beyond our borders, giving hope where there's despair, love where there is hate, and dignity where before there was only humiliation. Very inspiring words. So here was an exhibit that we did at Yosemite National Park on 58 major national parks and the inspirational nature of wilderness and nature as sources of inspiration. For each park, there was a picture of it, a little description of it, and then an inspirational quote. So for Great Smoky Mountains National Park, which is on the east coast of the United States, we had a quote by a Cherokee elder named Jerry Wolf. And this is what he said. The Great Smoky Mountains are a sanctuary for the Cherokee people. We have always believed the mountains and streams provide all that we need for survival. We hold these mountains sacred, believing that the Cherokees were chosen to take care of the mountains as the mountains take care of us. A beautiful expression of the reciprocal nature of the relationship between humans and mountains and nature in general. Now, turning to climate change, as I said, I began climbing in the 1960s with Nuevos Horizontes, and we climbed this peak called Iliniza Sur. And you can see it's covered with glaciers in 1963. I came back in 2003, and this is what the mountain looked like. Almost all the glaciers were gone from climate change. Now, up to the north, just north of the equator, there's another mountain which is very sacred to the local people called Cotacachi. And all of its glaciers have disappeared and its snow cover. The mountain is now black where it used to be white. And the local people are very concerned. They think that Mama Cotacachi, as they refer to the mountain, is angry with them. And they've hired shamans, for example, to do rituals to propitiate her. Now, these are a couple of shamans or curanderos, healers that I interviewed in Cusco, Peru. And the one on the left is probably the highest category called of these healers, traditional healers, called an Alto Mesayoc. And the way throughout the Andes, traditional healers get their power to diagnose and heal through their relationship, especially in Peru, with the Apus, or spirits of sacred mountains. And the way the highest category of these traditional healers is chosen is he's up on a high ridge and is struck by a bolt of lightning and killed, and then a second bolt immediately revives him. Certainly much more difficult to become a curandero or traditional healer than a doctor here at your universities in my country and yours. Now, this is Lake Imja, which is at the foot of Lhotse, one of the peaks in the Everest Massif. And you can see this glacial lake that's formed here. This is a serious problem, especially in the Himalayas, also in the Andes, because the glaciers are melting, forming these lakes, and they're held in place by very insubstantial dams of loose moraine rock. And when they give way, there are enormous glacial outburst floods that sweep away villages and so on. This lake is above a lot of villages, and the Sherpas are especially concerned about it. So there are various ways of dealing with it. And my friend, the abbot of Pengboche Monastery, who unfortunately passed away a year or so ago, what he was doing toward the end of his life, he felt that climate change was happening because people were no longer practicing religion very well. And so that was leading to deterioration of the climate. So his way of arresting it was to make ceremonial vases like this one, which he gave to Sherpas to put in critical parts of the environment, like the summit of Mount Everest, and one of them up at this lake, which he said arrested the increase in the size of the lake temporarily. He gave me one of these to take back to the United States and plant in the mountains of California. Now, switching here to the Alps, this is the Aletsch Glacier in Switzerland, the longest glacier in the Alps. And of course, glaciers here are also dwindling. And because of the cultural, spiritual, and aesthetic importance of the Alps, which we've seen, people have been holding demonstrations on the Aletsch to protest climate change. They've been covering smaller glaciers to keep them from melting in the summer. And they even held a funeral in 2019 for a glacier that disappeared in Switzerland. And every year at the snout of this glacier, the local priest besieges God to save the glaciers above them by saying, "Glacier is ice, Ice is water, water is life. You can see the direct. So here, as we get close to the end of my talk, is the Ganges River flowing, the most sacred river in the world for hundreds of millions of Hindus, flowing past the sacred city of Varanasi or Benares, the most holy city in India. And the problem is that the glacial source of the Ganges is retreating. And this has alarmed a lot of people in India. Indian environmentalists have tried to use this threat to the source of India's most sacred river to basically try to put pressure on the Indian government to reduce the production of greenhouse gases, because India is the second largest consumer of coal in the world after China. Now, if religious arguments like this work, they could have a significant impact on climate change throughout the world, although it's a very difficult proposition. So finally, with the last few slides, I'd like to read a passage from near the end of my book. The contemplation of sacred mountains with their special power to awaken another deeper way of experiencing reality opens us to a sense of the sacred in our own homes and communities, a sense that we need to cultivate in order to live in harmony with our environment and with each other. In looking up to the heights and reflecting on the world around them, we discover within ourselves something that enables us to lead deeper and more meaningful lives. And finally, this last picture that I took many years ago of my two young sons when they were playing in the roots of an overturned giant sequoia tree in the Sierra Nevada mountains of California. These final lines from my book on sacred mountains of the world. Mountains help us to regain that sense of freshness and wonder possessed by a child. Eyes bright and clear, hearts open and free, we stand once again at the beginning and source of all that is and all that may be. Thank you.